Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Picture this, October 13th, 1806. The city of Jena trembles. Through narrow cobblestone streets, past half-timbered houses where families huddle behind shuttered windows, a solitary figure rides on horseback. Not just any figure. The man who has conquered half of Europe, who holds the fate of nations in his hands, who carries the ideals of revolution on the tips of his bayonets, Napoleon Bonaparte. And watching from a window, clutching the final pages of a manuscript that represents 7 years of agonizing work, stands a 36-year-old philosopher with everything to lose. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel has just finished writing what will become one of the most influential books in human history. But tonight, as French cannons position themselves on the hills outside the city, as Prussian soldiers prepare for a battle they cannot win, Hegel faces a different kind of terror. He must send his manuscript, his only copy, through a war zone. If it's lost, 7 years of work vanishes like smoke. Tomorrow, 30,000 men will die on the fields outside this university town. Empires will fall, the old world will burn, and in the chaos, one philosopher will see something that changes everything. He will call Napoleon the world's soul on horseback, a phrase so strange, so provocative, that we're still arguing about what it means. What did Hegel see that night? What revelation struck him as he watched history itself ride past his window? And what was in those precious pages that had to survive the carnage? Tonight, we're going to follow a mind that didn't just think about history from a comfortable distance. We're following someone who lived through the most violent transformation Europe had seen in 1,000 years, who heard the cannons and smelled the gunpowder, who lost his job and struggled to feed his illegitimate son while trying to explain why all of this suffering might actually mean something. We're going to explore a philosopher who dared to suggest that history isn't just one random thing after another, but a story with direction, with meaning, with purpose. A philosopher whose ideas spawned both revolutionary communism and conservative nationalism, who was claimed by atheists and theologians alike, who was called both the height of human reason and the most dangerous mind in Europe. But let's start where all great stories start, in the darkness before dawn, in a city waiting for battle, with a desperate man and a manuscript that might not survive the night. The sound of distant cannon fire rolls across the hills like thunder. Hegel writes by candlelight, his hand cramping, racing against time. The French army is coming, everyone knows it. The Prussian forces that were supposed to protect Jena have already begun their chaotic retreat. Soon, very soon, foreign soldiers will pour through these streets, and Hegel has to get his manuscript to the publisher in Bamberg before everything descends into chaos. He's calling it the Phenomenology of Spirit. The title alone tells you nothing, but inside these pages, Hegel believes he's captured something extraordinary. The story of how human consciousness wakes up to itself, how we go from being mere animals responding to stimuli to beings who can understand the very structure of reality. It's ambitious. It's audacious. Some will say it's insane, but Hegel knows that if these pages are lost, if the manuscript doesn't make it through, he's finished. He has no money, no position, no prospects. This book is everything. October 13th. He seals the final pages. The postmaster, a woman named Voigt, agrees to hold the package until morning, until she can find a way to get it safely to Bamberg. Hegel walks through the dark streets back to his lodgings, and that's when he sees him, Napoleon, riding out to survey his positions, surrounded by officers, the man who has turned Europe upside down. Hegel watches, and something happens in that moment. Some connection is made, some understanding crystallizes. Later, Hegel will write to his friend Niethammer, "I saw the Emperor, this world's soul, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual, who concentrated here at a single point astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. The world's soul on horseback. What does that even mean? How can one man be the soul of the world? What kind of philosophy produces such a strange, mystical phrase? And why, in the middle of a war with his life's work hanging by a thread, does Hegel feel wonder, rather than fear. To understand that moment, we need to go back before the cannons, before Napoleon, before everything. We need to understand how a boy from Stuttgart became a man who would see divine purpose in military conquest, who would find meaning in violence, who would dare to claim that all of human history was building toward this precise moment. We need to understand what makes someone look at revolution and terror and war and say, yes, this is how it has to be. This is how consciousness learns. This is how spirit, whatever that means, comes to know itself. The story begins not with Hegel's birth, but with an execution. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born on August 27, 1770, in Stuttgart, in the German state of Württemberg, a comfortable middle-class family. His father worked in the Duke's administration, nothing remarkable. A normal childhood, by the standards of the time. He attended good schools. He was studious, perhaps a bit too serious, the kind of boy who copied lengthy passages from books into notebooks, trying to capture and organize knowledge. His mother taught him Latin declensions when he was 3 years old. When he was 13, she died of fever. Hegel and his father caught the same illness. They barely survived. But the date of his birth, that's what matters, August 1770. Which means that when Hegel turned 19, he was the perfect age to watch the most spectacular political upheaval in European history unfold before his eyes. July 14th, 1789. The Bastille falls. News spreads across Europe like wildfire. In Germany, young intellectuals gather in taverns and coffee houses, reading newspapers, debating, dreaming. The French have done it. They've actually done it. They've challenged the divine right of kings. They've declared that people, ordinary people, can govern themselves. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Hegel is a student at the Tübingen Seminary. He's supposed to be studying theology, preparing for a career as a Lutheran minister. Instead, he's reading Rousseau, Kant, the pamphlets streaming out of revolutionary France. He's not alone. His roommates are 2 other brilliant students, Friedrich Hölderlin, who will become one of Germany's greatest poets, and Friedrich Schelling, who will become a major philosopher in his own right. The 3 of them form a tight friendship. They call themselves the Invisible Church. They talk late into the night about freedom, about reason, about what it means to live in an age of transformation. And then, in the spring of 1791, something happens that becomes legend. Some students at Tübingen plant a freedom tree in the marketplace, a revolutionary symbol imported from France. They dance around it, singing songs of liberty. The authorities are not amused. The students are disciplined. But the message is clear. The fire of revolution has jumped across the Rhine. German youth are awake. They're not content with the old order of princes and priests and privileges. They want something new. Hegel graduates in 1793. But 1793 is also the year everything goes wrong in France. King Louis XVI has been executed in January. The Reign of Terror begins. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety start sending thousands to the guillotine. The revolution, which promised liberty, delivers rivers of blood instead. How does a young idealist process this? How does someone who believed in the promise of freedom make sense of the terror? Most people chose sides. Either the revolution was pure evil, a demonstration that common people cannot govern themselves, proof that the old order was right all along, or the violence was just a temporary deviation, a necessary purge, something that had to happen before true freedom could emerge. But Hegel, and this is crucial to understanding everything that follows, Hegel doesn't choose. He holds both truths at once. The revolution is necessary. The violence is real. Both are true. Both are part of the same process. The terror isn't a deviation from the revolution. It's part of the revolution. Freedom doesn't arrive clean and pure. It arrives covered in blood, screaming, violent, terrifying. And somehow, this is the radical part. Somehow, that's exactly how it has to be. This is the insight that will shape everything Hegel writes. Change isn't smooth. Progress isn't gentle. You don't get from one state to another by polite evolution. You get there through contradiction, through tension, through things getting worse before they get better. The old world doesn't step aside gracefully. It has to be destroyed. And that destruction is agonizing. But it's also necessary. It's also, in some strange way, rational. After graduation, Hegel can't find a proper position. He becomes a private tutor, basically an educated servant in wealthy households. First in Bern, Switzerland, then in Frankfurt. He's nobody. He's broke. He writes philosophy in his spare time, but nothing gets published. Meanwhile, his friend Schelling is becoming famous, publishing books, getting university appointments. Hegel is 30 years old and going nowhere. His father dies and leaves him a small inheritance, enough to finally escape tutoring and try something else. In 1801, Hegel moves to Jena, where Schelling has helped arrange a position for him at the university. Jena is the centre of German intellectual life. Kant's philosophy has revolutionized how people think. Fichte is developing his own system. Schelling is there, brilliant and ambitious. The romantic poets are around. It's exciting. It's electric. Everything is being questioned. Everything is being reimagined. Hegel arrives hungry, ready to finally make his mark. But he's awkward. His lectures aren't popular. Students prefer the more charismatic professors. And then, slowly, Hegel begins to develop a reputation for something else. Depth, systematic rigor, the willingness to think through problems all the way to their foundations. He starts writing, a critique of Fichte, a dialogue on natural law. He's trying to work out his own position, his own system. And all the while, Europe is convulsing. Napoleon has taken power in France through a coup d'etat. He's crowned himself emperor. He's marching across Europe, defeating the old powers, Austria, Prussia, the Holy Roman Empire. Everything is in flux, and Hegel watches all of this and thinks, what if this chaos has a logic? What if history, which looks like nothing but violence and accident and chance, is actually following some kind of pattern? What if human consciousness is developing, growing, becoming more aware of itself, and all these wars and revolutions are the birth pangs of something new? In 1805, Hegel becomes an extraordinary professor at Jena, unsalaried, dependent on student fees. He's still poor. And then something happens that will complicate his life for years. His landlady, Christiane Fischer, becomes pregnant. In February 1806, she gives birth to a boy, Ludwig, Hegel's illegitimate son. He acknowledges paternity. He'll later try to provide for Ludwig, even though it strains his finances to the breaking point. But in 1806, all he knows is that he now has a child, no money, and a book he desperately needs to finish. The book that will become the Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel has been working on it for years. It keeps growing, becoming more ambitious, more sprawling. It's supposed to be an introduction to his philosophical system, but it's becoming something else, a vast narrative of how consciousness develops from its most primitive forms all the way to what Hegel calls absolute knowing, the point where spirit finally understands itself completely. And then, in October 1806, history comes to Jena. Napoleon's army is marching on Prussia. The Prussian forces are in disarray. Everyone knows a battle is coming, and Hegel is frantically finishing his manuscript, writing faster than he's ever written, knowing that the publisher's deadline is about to be overtaken by cannon fire. October 13th. The French enter Jena. Hegel sends his manuscript. That same day, he sees Napoleon ride through the streets. The next day, October 14th, the Battle of Jena takes place. It's not even close. Napoleon utterly crushes the Prussian army. More than 25,000 Prussians are killed, wounded, or captured. The French lose fewer than 7,000. It's a catastrophe for Prussia. The old military power that dominated northern Germany is revealed as a paper tiger. Within weeks, Napoleon occupies Berlin. Prussia essentially ceases to exist as an independent power. Hegel's manuscript makes it to Bamberg. Against all odds, the pages survive. But Hegel's world doesn't survive. Jena is occupied. The university collapses, students flee. There's no money. Hegel is desperate. He writes to friends begging for help, for any kind of position. In 1807, he moves to Bamberg and becomes the editor of a local newspaper. It's humiliating for a philosopher, but he needs money to support Ludwig and himself. And all the while, The Phenomenology of Spirit is being typeset, printed, distributed. It appears in 1807. It's massive. It's difficult. It's unlike anything anyone has written before. Some people are baffled. Some are intrigued. But very few understand what Hegel has actually done. What he's done is this. He's written the biography of consciousness itself. He's told the story of how awareness goes from its most basic level, simple sense certainty, the immediate feeling that this exists right now, all the way to the highest level, absolute knowing, where consciousness finally understands that it has been studying itself all along, that subject and object are one, that the journey of consciousness is spirit coming to know itself through us. But here's the thing. This isn't just abstract philosophy. Hegel has woven together philosophy, psychology, social theory, history, religion, and politics into one massive narrative. The story he's telling is simultaneously about individual consciousness developing from childhood to maturity, about human societies evolving from primitive communities to modern states, and about spirit, God, reason, the absolute, whatever you want to call it, actualizing itself. Through history, it's staggering in its ambition, and at the center of it, in one of the most famous passages Hegel ever wrote, is a story, a parable, an allegory that will influence everyone from Marx to Freud to Sartre to Simone de Beauvoir, the story of the master and the slave. Let's tell it the way Hegel does, as narrative first, philosophical analysis later. Two self-conscious beings meet. Before this moment, each one has existed alone in the world. Each one has experienced itself as the center of everything. Each one's desires, needs, and perspectives have been the measure of reality. The world existed to satisfy me. My hunger made food matter. My fear made danger real. I was the standard by which all things were judged. But now, each encounters another consciousness, another being who is also self-aware, another center of experience. And immediately, without thinking about it, each recognizes a problem. This other consciousness challenges my supremacy. Their perspective competes with mine. Their needs conflict with mine. Their existence threatens to reduce me from being the measure of all things to being just one thing among others. How does each consciousness respond to this threat? They fight, not over resources or territory, but over something deeper, recognition. Each consciousness needs the other to acknowledge its supremacy, to confirm that it is indeed the master of reality, the one whose perspective matters, the one whose freedom is absolute. So they engage in what Hegel calls a struggle to the death. They're willing to risk everything, even life itself, to prove that they care more about freedom than about mere survival. Each one is saying through their actions, I am not merely an animal clinging to existence. I transcend biological need. I am pure freedom. But here's the problem. If one consciousness kills the other, the whole point of the struggle is lost. Dead people can't give recognition. Dead people can't acknowledge your superiority. So the struggle must end differently. One consciousness, in the face of death, chooses life. They back down. They submit. They say, in effect, I value existence more than I value absolute freedom. I will accept subordination in exchange for survival. And so, we have the master and the slave. The master is the one who is willing to die for freedom. The slave is the one who chose life over freedom. And the master has won, right? The master has achieved recognition. The slave now acknowledges the master's supremacy. The master is free to do as they please, while the slave must obey, must serve, must satisfy the master's needs. But here's where Hegel springs his trap, because this victory contains the seeds of its own reversal. Think about what the master's life becomes. The master doesn't work. The master doesn't engage directly with the world. When the master is hungry, the slave prepares food. When the master desires something, the slave provides it. The slave is the one who wrestles with nature, who plants and harvests, who makes and builds and creates. The master simply consumes. This sounds nice. But look what's happening. The master's consciousness is becoming passive, lazy, dependent. The master relates to the world only through the mediation of the slave. The master doesn't develop skills. The master doesn't learn how to transform raw materials into useful objects. The master just wants and receives. The master is becoming a kind of infant, totally dependent on the slave for everything. Meanwhile, look at the slave's development. The slave is forced to work. The slave must delay gratification, must learn discipline, must figure out how to shape nature to meet the master's demands. And in this process of working, of creating, of transforming the world, the slave develops something crucial. The slave develops self-consciousness through labor. Here's how. When the slave creates something, a tool, a piece of furniture, a cultivated field, the slave sees themselves reflected in their creation. The object carries the mark of the slave's will, the slave's intelligence, the slave's effort. The slave looks at what they've made and thinks, I did that. That exists because of me. I have shaped the world. And in that moment, the slave achieves recognition not from the master, but from their own work. The master, remember, receives recognition from the slave. But the slave's recognition is worthless because the slave is not free, is not an equal. You can't get genuine recognition from someone you've enslaved. It's like forcing someone to tell you they love you. The words mean nothing because they're coerced. But the slave achieves genuine self-consciousness. The slave comes to understand themselves as a being capable of transforming reality, of imposing will on matter, of creating meaning. The slave becomes truly human through work. And the master? The master becomes increasingly dependent, increasingly infantile, increasingly less able to actually survive without the slave. If the slave was suddenly to disappear, the master would be helpless. But if the master disappeared, the slave would be fine. Better than fine. The slave has all the actual skills, all the real competence, all the genuine engagement with reality. So, who's really free? Who has achieved authentic self-consciousness? Paradoxically, the slave. The one who lost the struggle for recognition has actually won something more important. Real self-understanding, real autonomy, real power. Hegel calls this the dialectic of master and slave, and it's crucial to understand what this means. A dialectic isn't just a back-and-forth argument. It's a specific kind of process where opposites are revealed to be interconnected, where each side requires the other to be what it is, and where the tension between them drives development toward a higher unity. The master needs the slave to be a master. The slave needs the master to be a slave. But each is also changing the other. The master's dependency grows while the slave's capability grows. Eventually, the relationship becomes unsustainable. The positions must either reverse or transcend into some new form where mutual recognition becomes possible. Now, here's the genius of Hegel's parable. It works on multiple levels simultaneously. As individual psychology, it describes how human beings develop self-consciousness through recognition from others, and how our need for that recognition shapes our relationships. As social history, it describes the relationship between aristocratic masters who don't work and labouring classes who do, and predicts that the labourers will eventually overcome their subordination because they possess real power. As metaphysics, it describes how spirit achieves self-consciousness through the painful process of alienation and return, of externalizing itself in matter and then recognizing itself in what it has created. This parable will haunt European thought for the next 2 centuries. Marx will take it and transform it into class struggle, the workers eventually overthrowing the capitalists because the workers actually produce everything and the capitalists are parasites. Existentialists will take it as a description of human relationships, where we're always struggling for recognition, always trying to assert our freedom against the perceived threat of the other's freedom. Feminist theorists will use it to analyze gender relations. Post-colonial thinkers will use it to understand the dynamics of colonial domination. But for Hegel himself, this parable is just one moment in a much larger story. The phenomenology doesn't end with the master-slave dialectic. It continues. Consciousness keeps developing. New forms emerge. Each stage both preserves and cancels what came before. Let's follow that journey. After the master-slave dialectic, Consciousness achieves a kind of freedom in Stoicism. The Stoic philosopher says, "I am free regardless of external circumstances. I can be enslaved in body but free in mind. My essence is reason, and reason is self-sufficient. The external world can't touch me. This is progress. The Stoic has achieved internal freedom. But there's a problem. This freedom is purely abstract. The Stoic withdraws from the world rather than engaging with it. The Stoic achieves peace, but at the cost of actual engagement with reality. This leads to skepticism. The skeptic doubts everything, questions everything, refuses to commit to any particular truth. The skeptic achieves a different kind of freedom, the freedom to stand apart from all determinate content, to never be pinned down. But the skeptic's freedom is purely negative. It's the freedom to say no, but not the freedom to affirm anything positive. And this contradiction leads to what Hegel calls the unhappy consciousness. This is consciousness that's divided against itself, that experiences its own essence as alien, as beyond itself, as something it can never reach. The primary example Hegel gives is medieval Christianity, where believers experience God as wholly other, as infinitely distant, and themselves as worthless sinners. They long for unity with God, but believe that unity is impossible. They're unhappy because they've projected their own essence onto something external, and then worship that external thing without recognizing it as their own creation. But consciousness keeps developing. Reason emerges. Consciousness now believes it can understand the world through rational investigation. Science becomes possible. The Enlightenment happens. Consciousness believes reason can grasp reality as it truly is. But reason operating alone, reason that thinks it can understand the world from a detached, objective standpoint, runs into problems. It can analyze and categorize, but it misses something crucial. It misses that the knower is part of what's being known, that consciousness isn't a spectator standing outside reality, but a participant within it. This realization leads to spirit, and here we enter the most historical, most concrete sections of the phenomenology. Spirit is consciousness that understands itself as essentially social, as existing only in relation to others, as shaped by culture and history. Hegel walks through different forms of spirit in history. Ancient Greece, where individuals experienced themselves as part of a beautiful, harmonious community, but hadn't yet developed modern individuality. Rome, where legal personhood emerged, but at the cost of genuine ethical life. The medieval period, where spirit was alienated from itself, projected into a transcendent heaven. The Enlightenment, where reason tried to reshape society according to rational principles. The French Revolution, where absolute freedom tried to actualize itself and descended into terror. Each stage is necessary. Each reveals something true about spirit's nature, but each is also one-sided, incomplete. Each contains contradictions that drive it forward into the next stage. And then, after religion, after consciousness tries to understand itself through imagery and narrative, through art and mythology and theology, we finally reach absolute knowing. This is the end point of the journey. This is where spirit finally understands that everything it has been studying, all the objects it has encountered, all the stages it has passed through, have been nothing but spirit itself. Subject and object are revealed to be one. The journey was always spirit coming to know itself. In absolute knowing, consciousness understands that thinking and being are identical, that reality is rational and reason is real, that the story of consciousness is the story of spirit actualizing itself, coming to awareness, achieving freedom. And this, Hegel believes, is where philosophy begins properly. Everything before was preparation. Now we can do real philosophy, not as a detached study of external objects, but as spirit, comprehending its own nature, its own development, its own necessity. It's breathtaking in its ambition. It's also utterly strange. Modern readers often don't know what to make of it. Is Hegel talking about psychology, history, metaphysics, religion? And the answer is all of them. Hegel refuses the modern separation of these domains. For him, they're all aspects of one process, spirit coming to know itself. But we need to understand what Hegel means by spirit, because this is where things get mystical and where critics start accusing Hegel of building a religious system dressed up as philosophy. In German, the word is Geist, which can be translated as either spirit or mind. It's not a separate thing, not a ghostly substance floating around. Spirit is human consciousness in its collective, historical, cultural dimensions. It's the shared meanings that make societies possible. It's the institutions, practices, art, religion, and philosophy through which human beings create meaningful worlds. But spirit is also more than just the sum of individual consciousnesses. It has a kind of agency, a kind of life of its own. It develops according to its own internal logic. And here's where Hegel gets controversial. Spirit is, in some sense, God. Not God as a separate supernatural being, but God as the totality of reality, coming to awareness of itself through human consciousness. This is why Hegel can be claimed by both atheists and theologians. Atheists say, Hegel has replaced God with history and human consciousness. Theologians say, Hegel has shown how God is present in history and human consciousness. Both are kind of right. The key point is that spirit isn't static. It develops. It moves through history. And history, for Hegel, isn't just one damn thing after another. History has direction. History has meaning. History is the story of spirit coming to know itself, of freedom actualizing itself, of reason becoming real in social institutions. This brings us to what might be Hegel's most famous and most controversial claim. World history is progress in the consciousness of freedom. Let's unpack this carefully, because it's easy to misunderstand and even easier to caricature. Hegel divides world history into 4 great epochs, each characterized by a different understanding of freedom. The Oriental world. In ancient Persia, China, India, only one person is free, the despot, the ruler. Everyone else is a subject, a slave. There's magnificence, there's order, there's culture. But freedom is concentrated in a single point. The despot is arbitrary, absolute, unconstrained by law or custom. This isn't true freedom because the despot's will is chaotic, driven by whim rather than reason. But it's a beginning. Consciousness has recognized that freedom is valuable, even if it hasn't yet understood what freedom truly means. The Greek and Roman world. Here, some are free. In Athens, citizens have rights, participate in governance, debate in the war assembly. But this freedom is limited. Women aren't free, slaves aren't free, foreigners aren't free. Freedom is a privilege of a particular class of people, and even for those who are free, their freedom is tied to the particular community they belong to. An Athenian is free as an Athenian, but strip away that citizenship, and the freedom disappears. It's not yet universal freedom as a basic human attribute. But consciousness has expanded. The idea of freedom has taken root in institutions, in practices, in social life. The Germanic or Christian world, here all are potentially free. Christianity introduces a revolutionary idea. Every human being, regardless of station, has infinite worth in God's eyes. Every person has a soul, and that soul is free. Kings and peasants, masters and slaves, all are equal before God. This is a massive conceptual breakthrough. Freedom is no longer tied to social position. It's inherent in being human. But there's a problem. In the medieval period, this freedom is purely internal and otherworldly. You're free in your soul, but your body is still constrained by feudal hierarchy. You're free in relation to God, but that doesn't change your material circumstances. Freedom is acknowledged but not actualized. It's a promise, not a reality. The breakthrough comes with the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment. Now freedom starts to become actual in the world. The Reformation says, you don't need a priest to mediate between you and God. Each individual has direct access to the divine. This is spiritual freedom becoming real. The Enlightenment says, reason isn't the property of kings and clergy. Every human being can think for themselves. This is intellectual freedom becoming real. The French Revolution says, sovereignty doesn't belong to monarchs. It belongs to the people. This is political freedom becoming real. And when Hegel watches Napoleon ride through Jena, he believes he's witnessing the culmination of this process. Napoleon isn't just a conqueror. He's spreading the institutions of freedom, legal equality, rational administration, the end of feudal privilege across Europe. He's actualizing freedom in history. Now, this is where people start objecting violently to Hegel. Does this mean Napoleon's wars are justified? Does this mean the thousands of deaths are just necessary sacrifices to progress? Does this mean Hegel is a warmonger, a justifier of violence, a totalitarian in philosophical clothing? It's complicated. Hegel is definitely not a simple apologist for violence. He recognizes suffering. He calls history a slaughter bench where the happiness of peoples, the wisdom of states, and the virtue of individuals have been sacrificed. He sees the tragedy. He's not callous about human pain, but Hegel does believe that historical progress requires sacrifice. He believes that the old order doesn't give way peacefully to the new. He believes that individuals are, in a sense, instruments of historical forces they don't fully understand. Napoleon doesn't know he's the world soul. He thinks he's pursuing personal glory and power. But through his actions, through the unintended consequences of his ambitions, freedom advances. Hegel calls this the cunning of reason. Reason uses human passions, human ambitions, human conflicts to achieve its own ends. People think they're acting for themselves, but they're actually serving larger historical purposes. Alexander the Great thought he was building an empire. Actually, he was spreading Greek culture and creating the conditions for Hellenistic philosophy. Julius Caesar thought he was seizing power. Actually, he was destroying the Republic and creating conditions for empire and Roman law. This sounds mystical, even sinister. Is Hegel saying there's some puppet master reason pulling strings? Not exactly. He's saying that historical change has a logic, that one stage leads to another. Not randomly, but according to patterns we can retrospectively understand, and that individuals who seem to be acting freely are actually caught up in processes much larger than themselves. Think about it this way. When people in 1789 stormed the Bastille, they thought they were attacking a symbol of royal tyranny. They weren't thinking, we are actualizing the Enlightenment concept of universal rights and rational sovereignty. But that's what they were doing. The ideas that intellectuals had been developing, Rousseau's social contract, Kant's autonomy, the Enlightenment's faith in reason, suddenly crystallized into action. Individuals thought they were responding to immediate grievances, but their actions had world historical significance they couldn't have predicted. This is the cunning of reason. It doesn't eliminate human freedom. People really are making choices, really are acting, but their actions have meanings and consequences they don't foresee. And when we look back at history, we can see patterns, see how one development led necessarily to another. Hegel's claim is that these patterns aren't arbitrary. History isn't chaos. It's spirit working itself out, freedom actualizing itself, consciousness becoming aware of itself. The direction is toward greater freedom, greater rationality, greater self-consciousness. Not in a smooth line, not without setbacks and catastrophes, but over the long arc. Is he right? That's one of the great questions. Marx will take this framework and transform it. Instead of the progress of freedom, Marx will see class struggle driving history forward. Instead of spirit becoming self-conscious, Marx will see material forces, economics, technology, determining human consciousness. But the basic structure remains. History has direction. Conflict drives progress. Individuals are caught up in forces they don't fully control. Existentialists will rebel against exactly this. Kierkegaard will insist that the individual can't be subsumed into historical processes, that individual, existence and choice are primary. Nietzsche will reject the whole idea of historical progress, seeing instead eternal recurrence, the will to power, amor fati. But Hegel's vision is powerful precisely because it tries to make sense of history's violence. It says, all this suffering means something. All these revolutions and wars and upheavals aren't just meaningless chaos. They're birth pangs. Freedom is being born. Consciousness is waking up. Spirit is coming to know itself. Whether that's consolation or horror depends on where you stand, but we need to pause here and examine more carefully what Hegel means by the state, because this is where he becomes most controversial, where critics accuse him of totalitarianism, where defenders insist he's been misunderstood. For Hegel, the state isn't just government, it's not just laws and bureaucracy and police power. The state is the actualization of ethical life, the concrete embodiment of freedom. This sounds abstract, but Hegel means something specific. Think about what freedom requires. Not just the absence of external constraints. That's only negative freedom. Freedom from interference. Real freedom, positive freedom, requires institutions, practices, relationships that enable people to actually achieve their purposes, to develop their capacities, to live meaningful lives. You can't be free in isolation. You need language to think, and language is social. You need education to develop your mind, and education requires institutions. You need property to provide for yourself, and property requires legal recognition and enforcement. You need family to develop emotional bonds, and family requires social acceptance of certain relationships as legitimate. You need professional work to find purpose, and professions require organization and regulation. All of this, the complex network of institutions and practices that enable human flourishing. This is what Hegel means by the state. It's not opposed to individual freedom. It's what makes individual freedom possible. Hegel distinguishes three levels of ethical life. First, the family, the realm of immediate emotional unity. In the family, individuals are not separate, self-interested agents. They're bound by love and natural feeling. The family provides the original experience of being part of something larger than yourself. But the family is particular, limited to blood relations. As individuals mature, they must leave the family and enter civil society. Civil society is the realm of market relations, of competing interests, of individuals pursuing their own goals. Here, unlike the family, people relate to each other as separate, self-interested agents. You work to earn money for yourself. You buy and sell in the market. You compete for positions and opportunities. Civil society is necessary. It's where individuals develop independence, learn to provide for themselves, exercise their particular talents. But left alone, civil society produces huge problems. Wealth concentrates, inequality grows. Some people become extremely rich while others fall into poverty. The invisible hand doesn't create harmony. It creates exploitation and alienation. This is where the state comes in, not as an external force imposing on civil society, but as the rational organization of civil society toward common purposes. The state regulates markets to prevent extreme inequality. It provides education and infrastructure. It protects rights. It creates space for meaningful work through professional corporations and guilds. Hegel is not defending absolute monarchy or authoritarianism. He actually criticizes both. Absolute monarchy, where one person's arbitrary will is law, isn't rational freedom. It's the Oriental despotism, where only one is free. And that one isn't truly free because their will is unconstrained by reason. Democracy, in its pure form, also has problems for Hegel. If democracy means the immediate will of the majority determines everything, then it's just majority tyranny. Rights get ignored. Minorities get oppressed. Mob rule replaces rational governance. Hegel's solution is constitutional monarchy with strong representative institutions. The monarch is important symbolically, representing the unity of the state, the point where decisions are finally made. But the monarch's power is constrained by constitution and law. Real governance happens through rational administration by trained bureaucrats, through representative bodies that articulate different interests, through corporations and associations that organize civil society. This sounds very Prussian, very conservative, and Hegel did defend the Prussian state of his time, up to a point. But he also criticized aspects of it. He thought Prussia needed stronger representative institutions, better legal protections, more rational organization. And remember, Prussia in the early 19th century was undergoing massive reform after the Napoleon defeat. It was modernizing, rationalizing, moving away from feudal structures. The deeper point Hegel is making is about the relationship between individual and community. Modern liberalism emphasizes individual rights, individual choice, individual autonomy, and Hegel values all of this, but he thinks individuals only become free individuals through participation in institutions and communities. You develop as a person through family, through education, through work, through citizenship. You don't find freedom by withdrawing from society. You find freedom by participating rationally in social life. The accusation of totalitarianism comes from lines like, "The state is the march of God through the world." That sounds like deifying the state, making it absolute, subordinating individuals to collective purposes. But Hegel's defenders point out the context. He's not saying the actual Prussian state or any existing state is divine. He's saying the idea of the rational state, the social institutions that enable freedom, this actualizes the divine plan. And individuals aren't subordinated to the state. They find their fullest development through the state. Still, you can see how Hegel's language invites misreading. And when 20th century totalitarians claimed Hegel as an ancestor, when fascists and Stalinists both appealed to dialectical progress and historical necessity, the critics had ammunition. Karl Popper's attack on Hegel in The Open Society and Its Enemies is devastating, painting Hegel as an enemy of individual liberty, a precursor to Hitler and Stalin. Modern Hegel scholars mostly reject this reading. They point out that Hegel valued legal rights, individual conscience, personal autonomy. His state isn't totalitarian, it's constitutional, limited, organized around enabling individual freedom. But the ambiguity in his writing creates space for interpretation and misinterpretation. And there's another problem with Hegel's political philosophy, his views on non-European peoples. Hegel divides world history into 4 epochs corresponding to 4 geographical regions: Oriental, Greek, Roman, and Germanic. And he explicitly says that Africa has no history, that indigenous Americans are primitive, that only European civilization has achieved true rational freedom. This isn't just Eurocentric bias, though it's certainly that. It's also racist in assuming that some peoples are inherently capable of rational development, while others aren't. Hegel's philosophy of history, which claims to be universal, actually excludes most of humanity from the story of freedom's progress. Modern readers have to grapple with this. We can't just excuse Hegel as a man of his time. His views on race and culture are integral to his system, not peripheral additions. And this raises deep questions about whether his whole approach is salvageable. If the dialectic of history is actually just European imperialism dressed up as philosophy, what value does it retain? Some scholars argue we can separate Hegel's method from his specific applications, that the dialectical approach and emphasis on recognition remain valuable even if his racist conclusions are rejected. Others argue the problems go deeper, that Hegel's entire framework assumes a single story of progress with Europe as the end point, and this assumption corrupts everything else. These aren't academic questions, they matter for how we think about global politics, cultural difference, development, and human rights. If we inherit Hegel's framework, we may unconsciously inherit his biases. If we reject his framework entirely, we lose tools for thinking about historical change and social conflict. The tension remains unresolved. Hegel's political philosophy offers profound insights about freedom, community, and institutions, but it also contains assumptions and prejudices that modern readers rightly find unacceptable. We're left trying to salvage what's valuable while recognizing what's poisonous. Let's shift perspective now. Let's look at how spirit achieves self-consciousness not through political history but through culture. Because for Hegel, art, religion, and philosophy aren't just optional extras, pleasant decorations on the serious business of economics and politics. They're how spirit comes to understand itself. They're how consciousness becomes explicit about what it's doing. Hegel distinguishes 3 forms of what he calls absolute spirit: art, religion, and philosophy. Each represents a different mode of spirit self-knowledge. Art is spirit knowing itself through sensuous intuition, through images, through beautiful objects that we can see and hear and touch. When you look at a great painting or sculpture, when you hear sublime music, something happens. You're not just perceiving a physical object, you're encountering meaning made visible, spirit made concrete in matter. The artwork isn't just representing something, it's actualizing spirit in sensuous form. Hegel traces a historical development through art. In symbolic art, the art of ancient Egypt, for example, there's a mismatch between meaning and form. The pyramids are massive, overwhelming, mysterious. They're trying to express something infinite, but they can only do it through finite matter. The meaning exceeds what can be shown. The pyramids point towards something beyond themselves, but that something remains obscure. In classical art, Greek sculpture particularly, form and content achieve perfect harmony. When you look at a classical Greek statue, the human body becomes the perfect vehicle for expressing human spirit. The gods take human form. Beauty is the visible manifestation of the ideal. There's nothing hidden, nothing that can't be shown. Spirit is perfectly at home in sensuous form. But this perfection is also a limitation, because spirit is more than just beautiful bodies. Spirit is interiority, subjectivity, infinite depth, and you can't show infinite interiority in a statue. The statue is always external, always limited to surface. This leads to romantic art, which for Hegel means Christian art, medieval and modern. Here, content exceeds form again, but in a different way than symbolic art. Now, we're trying to express infinite inwardness, divine love, spiritual transformation, and no sensuous form is adequate. Painting tries through colour and light to suggest something beyond what's shown. Music becomes crucial because it's the least material of arts, pure sound that seems to express emotion directly. Poetry uses words to evoke rather than depict, but eventually, art reaches its limit. And this is Hegel's famous and controversial claim: art is a thing of the past. Not that people stop making art, but art can no longer be the highest expression of spirit's self-understanding. Spirit has developed to a point where sensuous expression isn't enough. We need something more conceptual, more explicit. This is where religion comes in. Religion takes what art expresses sensuously and represents it narratively through stories, myths, doctrines. Religion says explicitly what art could only show implicitly. God isn't just a beautiful statue. God is a person with intentions and will and love. History isn't just a sequence of events. It's a drama of fall and redemption. Human existence isn't just a tragic fate. It's a journey with meaning and purpose. Hegel sees religious consciousness developing through stages. Natural religions worship natural forces: the sun, fertility, power. Religions of spiritual individuality, Judaism, Greek religion, Roman religion, worship personal gods, gods with character and will. But these gods remain separate from the human external powers that must be propitiated. Christianity, for Hegel, is the absolute religion because it expresses a crucial truth. The divine and the human are not separate. In Christ, God becomes human. The infinite enters the finite. The gap between the divine and the human is overcome, and the crucifixion and resurrection enact the dialectical movement. Spirit must die to itself as separate must negate itself in order to achieve true self-consciousness in and through the human. But religion, while it grasps this truth, expresses it in pictorial form through stories and images. It says, God became man in Jesus. But this is a historical claim about a particular person at a particular time. Religion hasn't yet grasped that what happened in Christ is the truth about all human consciousness, about the structure of spirit as such. This is philosophy's task. Philosophy takes the content of religion, the unity of divine and human, the process of alienation and return, the actualization of spirit through history, and expresses it conceptually. Philosophy makes explicit what religion knew implicitly. Philosophy shows that the story of Christ is the story of spirit, that incarnation and crucifixion and resurrection aren't just events that happened once, but describe the permanent structure of how consciousness achieves itself. And this means that philosophy is the highest form of absolute spirit. In philosophy, spirit finally understands itself conceptually, rationally, completely. Philosophy is spirit comprehending itself. But philosophy doesn't replace art and religion. Each form has its own validity, its own way of accessing truth. We still need art to give us intuitive, sensuous encounters with meaning. We still need religion to provide narrative, community, ritual. But philosophy achieves the most complete self-consciousness. And here's the crucial point. Philosophy is also historical. Different philosophies emerge at different times because spirit is developing, consciousness is evolving. Ancient Greek philosophy asked certain questions and gave certain answers because consciousness was at a particular stage. Medieval philosophy was different because consciousness had developed differently. Modern philosophy, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, represents consciousness becoming more and more self-aware. And Hegel believes his own philosophy represents the culmination of this development, not because he's smarter than previous philosophers, but because he's living at a time when spirit has finally achieved the conditions for complete self-consciousness. The French Revolution has actualized political freedom. The Reformation has actualized spiritual freedom. The Enlightenment has actualized intellectual freedom. And now philosophy can comprehend this whole development, can see the pattern, can articulate what spirit has been doing all along. This sounds incredibly arrogant. Who does Hegel think he is, claiming his philosophy is the end point of history? But Hegel would say he's not making a claim about himself personally. He's making a claim about the age he lives in. Spirit has reached a stage where complete self-consciousness is possible. Someone had to articulate it. It happened to be him. But if it wasn't Hegel, it would have been someone else. The content is what matters, not the individual. Still, you can see why people reacted strongly to this. Is Hegel claiming history has ended, that philosophy has reached its final form, that nothing new can happen after him? Not quite. Hegel isn't saying political history ends, that people stop making art, that religion disappears, that no new philosophical ideas emerge. He's saying that the fundamental structure of spirit self-consciousness has been achieved. The basic patterns have been revealed. Future developments will be variations on these themes, not completely new principles. But even this modified claim has been endlessly debated, and Hegel's own students quickly split into factions arguing about what he really meant, what followed from his ideas, whether his system was conservative or revolutionary. Which brings us to the next chapter of our story. What happened after Hegel? When Hegel died in 1831 from cholera, he was at the height of his influence. He'd moved from Jena to Bamberg to Nuremberg as a school administrator, to Heidelberg and finally to Berlin, where he held the most prestigious philosophy chair in Germany. He was the state philosopher, the systematic thinker whose lectures drew hundreds of students. His system seemed complete, authoritative, definitive, and then it exploded. Almost immediately after his death, his followers split into two camps, the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians. The right Hegelians, older, more conservative, interpreted Hegel as supporting the Prussian state, traditional Christianity, and existing social order. For them, Hegel had shown that spirit was actualizing itself in present institutions. The modern state, constitutional monarchy, reformed Christianity. These were spirit becoming real. Philosophy's job was to comprehend and affirm this reality, not to criticize or change it. The left Hegelians, younger, more radical, read Hegel completely differently. For them, Hegel's dialectic was a tool for criticism. Yes, spirit develops through history, but that means present reality isn't final. There's always another dialectical movement coming. The contradictions in current society will drive it forward into new forms. And philosophy's job isn't to justify what exists, but to push toward what's coming. The leader of the radical movement was Ludwig Feuerbach. In 1841, he published The Essence of Christianity, which turned Hegel upside down. Hegel had said, spirit externalizes itself in nature and human history, then returns to itself in philosophy. Feuerbach said, no, humans externalize their own essence and call it God. Religion is anthropology in disguise. When we say God is loving, we're really expressing human love. When we say God is wise, we're really expressing human wisdom. God is a projection of human nature, alienated from itself. This was explosive. Feuerbach was saying, theology is really about humans, not about some transcendent spirit. And if we understand this, we can reclaim what we've projected outward. We can stop worshipping an imaginary God and start affirming actual human beings. The young Karl Marx was a student in Berlin just after Hegel's death. He was part of the left Hegelian circle, and Feuerbach's critique hit him like a thunderbolt. If theology is really anthropology, what else is disguised reality? What else pretends to be about one thing, but is really about another? Marx's answer: philosophy itself. Philosophy talks about ideas, about consciousness, about spirit, but really, Marx says, ideas don't drive history. Material conditions drive history. The way people produce their food, their shelter, their goods, this determines everything else. Economics is the foundation. Politics, law, philosophy, religion, art. These are the superstructure, the reflections of underlying economic relations. Hegel had said, consciousness determines being, ideas shape reality. Marx says, being determines consciousness, material life shapes ideas. The ruling ideas of any age are the ideas of the ruling class. Philosophy isn't spirit coming to know itself. Philosophy is ideology, justification for existing power relations. But here's the thing. Marx doesn't reject Hegel's method. He keeps the dialectic. He keeps the idea that history has direction, that conflict drives progress, that contradictions must be resolved. He just changes what's doing the developing. Instead of spirit or consciousness, the driving force is class struggle. Instead of the master-slave dialectic being about recognition, it becomes about economic exploitation. The capitalist is the master, the worker is the slave. The capitalist owns the means of production, the worker must sell their labour to survive. The capitalist gets rich off the worker's labour. The worker gets just enough to keep working. But here's where the Hegelian dialectic comes in. Just like the slave in Hegel's parable achieves self-consciousness through work, the workers under capitalism develop class consciousness. They realise they're the ones creating all the value. They realise the capitalists are parasites. And eventually, through revolution, they overthrow the capitalists and create a classless society. The communist society Marx envisions is actually similar to Hegel's absolute knowing. It's the end point of history, where contradiction is overcome, where alienation ends, where humans finally achieve authentic community and freedom. Marx has kept Hegel's structure, but translated it from philosophy into economics. And here's the irony. Hegel's philosophy, which seemed to support the conservative Prussian state, became the theoretical foundation for revolutionary communism. The dialectic, which Hegel used to explain how spirit achieves itself, became the tool for analysing capitalism and predicting its overthrow. Marx famously said he stood Hegel on his head, or actually, he put Hegel right side up, since Hegel had everything inverted. For Marx, the real foundation is material, not ideal. Economics, not ideas. But the dialectical method remains. History still has direction. Contradictions still drive progress. Alienation still demands overcoming. But while Marx was developing his materialist critique, another young Hegelian was mounting a completely different attack. His name was Søren Kierkegaard. And he thought the entire Hegelian project was not just wrong but dangerous, even evil. Kierkegaard's critique came from a completely different angle. He didn't care about materialism versus idealism. He cared about the individual versus the system. And he thought Hegel's system destroyed what was most important about human existence: the individual, existing person making actual choices in uncertainty and anxiety. Here's Kierkegaard's complaint. Hegel presents history as a rational process where everything makes sense retrospectively. Every stage is necessary. Every development is comprehensible. Spirit knows itself completely. From the standpoint of absolute knowing, everything is transparent. Everything fits together. Everything is mediated into the whole. But, Kierkegaard says, that's the view from nowhere. That's the view from eternity. That's not how actual human beings live. We don't live in retrospect. We live forward. We face choices without knowing their outcomes. We experience anxiety about our freedom. We must decide without complete knowledge. And this is what it means to exist. Hegel talks about existence, but for Hegel, existence is just a category, a logical moment in the dialectic. Kierkegaard says, no, existence is what I am doing right now, this irreducible, immediate, urgent actuality of being a self, and this can't be captured in a system. You can't systematize existence because existence is always ahead of itself, always becoming, always at risk. Think about a real choice you've had to make, not a trivial choice like what to eat for breakfast, but a significant life choice. Should you marry this person? Should you take this job? Should you have children? Should you leave your community? In making these choices, you don't have the luxury of stepping back into absolute knowing and seeing how everything will work out. You must choose in uncertainty. You must leap without seeing the ground beneath you. And the anxiety you feel in such moments, that's not a weakness to be overcome. That's existence itself. That's what it means to be a free being. You're not following a script. You're not a moment in some grand historical process. You're a singular individual making a choice that will define who you become. Kierkegaard introduces concepts that will become central to existentialism: anxiety, despair, the leap of faith. Let's explore these more carefully. Anxiety is different from fear. Fear has an object. You're afraid of something specific. Anxiety has no object. It's the feeling you get when you confront your freedom, when you realize that nothing determines what you must do, that you must choose, and that your choice will shape your life in ways you can't predict. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff. You feel fear of falling, but you also feel something else, a strange pull, an awareness that you could jump, that nothing prevents you except your own decision. That vertiginous feeling is anxiety. It's not fear of the cliff. It's confrontation with your own freedom to jump or not to jump. Kierkegaard says we experience anxiety whenever we confront genuine choice. And modern life, with its emphasis on individual freedom, creates more anxiety than traditional societies, where roles and paths were predetermined. You must choose your career, your relationships, your values, your identity. And these choices happen in uncertainty. This is liberating and terrifying simultaneously. Despair is the condition of a self misaligned with itself. Kierkegaard distinguishes different forms of despair. There's the despair of not willing to be yourself, trying to be something you're not, living according to others' expectations, fleeing from your authentic possibilities. There's the despair of willing desperately to be yourself, asserting your will in defiance of everything, trying to create yourself ex nihilo as if you had no conditions, no limits. And there's the deepest despair, not being conscious that you're in despair, living inauthentically without even knowing it. The only way out of despair, Kierkegaard says, is faith. But faith isn't rational belief. It's not accepting propositions that seem reasonable. Faith is a leap, a passionate commitment made without adequate rational grounds, a relationship with the absolute that can't be mediated by concepts or comprehended by systems. For Kierkegaard, the example is Abraham being commanded to sacrifice Isaac. From a rational, ethical standpoint, this is madness. Abraham should refuse. Murder is wrong. There's no way to justify killing your son. Universal ethical principles clearly prohibit it. But Abraham trusts God and proceeds. This is what Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical. Faith sometimes requires going beyond universal ethical rules into a direct relationship with the absolute that can't be mediated or rationalized. Hegel would say, this is primitive religious consciousness, not yet risen to the level of rational comprehension. Abraham doesn't understand that the story represents the movement from natural immediacy to ethical universality. Kierkegaard says this completely misses the point. Abraham's faith is precisely what can't be comprehended, what exceeds reason, what marks him as a singular individual in relation to the absolute. The contrast couldn't be starker. Hegel wants to comprehend everything. Kierkegaard says the most important things can't be comprehended, only lived. Hegel sees the individual as a moment in the development of spirit. Kierkegaard sees the individual as irreducibly singular, the one thing that systems can't capture. Kierkegaard develops his critique through different pseudonymous works, each representing a different existence sphere. The aesthetic sphere, living for immediate pleasure and sensation, but this leads to boredom and despair. The ethical sphere, living according to universal moral principles, but this leads to guilt and recognition that you can't fully live up to the ideal. The religious sphere, passionate relationship with God, acceptance of being a sinner who needs grace, authentic existence before the absolute. Each sphere offers a form of life, a way of existing, and you can't rationally deduce which is correct. You must choose, and choosing means leaping, committing yourself without complete justification. This deeply personal approach to philosophy was revolutionary. Philosophy traditionally sought objective truth accessible to any rational person. Kierkegaard insisted that the most important truths are subjective, accessible only through personal appropriation, through lived experience that can't be translated into universal concepts. He wrote, "Truth is subjectivity, not meaning truth is arbitrary or merely personal, meaning the truth that matters most, how to live, what to value, how to relate to the absolute. This truth only exists in the passionate appropriation of it. You can't understand faith by studying theology. You must believe. You can't understand authentic existence by analysing concepts. You must exist authentically." And yet, both Hegel and Kierkegaard are responding to the same cultural moment, the sense that traditional certainties have collapsed, that modernity demands new ways of understanding ourselves and our place in the world. Hegel responds by constructing a comprehensive rational system. Kierkegaard responds by insisting on the limits of reason and the primacy of individual existence. The 20th century will be haunted by this debate. Existentialism, Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, will carry forward Kierkegaard's emphasis on existence, authenticity, freedom, and anxiety. Marxism will carry forward Hegel's dialectical method applied to history and society. And analytic philosophy will largely reject both, seeking clarity and precision instead of grand narratives. But there's another response to Hegel that's darker, more troubling. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the late 19th century, launches an all-out assault on Hegel and everything he represents. Nietzsche doesn't just disagree with Hegel. He thinks Hegel is symptomatic of everything wrong with Western philosophy and Western civilization. The optimism, the rationalism, the faith in progress, the belief that suffering has meaning. Nietzsche sees all of this as life-denying, as weakness disguised as strength, as slave morality dressed up as philosophical truth. For Nietzsche, there is no spirit developing through history. There's no rational progress toward freedom. There's no teleology, no meaning, no purpose. There's just the will to power, the fundamental drive in all living things to assert themselves, to grow, to dominate, to create. History isn't progress. History is eternal recurrence, the same patterns repeating endlessly. There are no world historical individuals serving spirit's purposes. There are just strong individuals imposing their will and weak individuals resenting them for it. And that master-slave dialectic that Hegel made famous? Nietzsche has his own version, and it's completely different. For Nietzsche, the masters are the strong, noble, life-affirming individuals who act from overflow of power. The slaves are the weak, resentful individuals who can't compete with the masters, and so develop a morality that condemns strength and celebrates weakness. Slave morality, Christianity being the prime example, says, "The humble shall inherit the earth, blessed are the meek, turn the other cheek." This isn't genuine morality. This is ressentiment, the revenge of the weak against the strong. The slaves can't defeat the masters physically, so they defeat them morally. They make strength into a sin and weakness into a virtue. And Hegel's philosophy, Nietzsche suggests, is just sophisticated slave morality. All this talk about rationality, about comprehending necessity, about reconciling ourselves to history, this is just accepting the world as it is, and calling that acceptance wisdom. Real philosophy would affirm life in all its tragedy, its meaninglessness, its eternal return. Real philosophy would create values rather than discovering them. Real philosophy would say yes to fate, amor fati, without needing to justify it as rational progress. Nietzsche's Übermensch, the overman, the superman, is the opposite of Hegel's world historical individual. The world historical individual unknowingly serves spirit's purposes. The Übermensch serves nothing, believes in nothing except life itself, creates their own values from the void. The world historical individual is comprehensible retrospectively as part of history's rational pattern. The Übermensch is incomprehensible because there's no pattern, no meaning to comprehend. This is philosophy as nihilism, as the rejection of all meaning-making, all consolation, all systematic thinking. It's as far from Hegel as you can get, while still engaging with the same questions. And yet, even Nietzsche is responding to Hegel, arguing against Hegel, trying to overcome Hegel. Hegel set the terms of debate for a century. You could accept his framework or reject it, but you couldn't ignore it. By the early 20th century, the landscape is fractured. In continental Europe, phenomenology emerges, Husserl trying to describe consciousness as it actually appears, Heidegger asking about the meaning of being. Existentialism develops from Kierkegaard through Nietzsche to Sartre. Marxism becomes a mass political movement, transforming Hegel's ideas into revolutionary practice. In Anglo-American philosophy, analysts reject grand systems entirely, focusing on language, logic, and scientific method. But then something strange happens. In 1930s Paris, a Russian philosopher named Alexandre Kojève starts giving lectures on Hegel's phenomenology. These lectures will become legendary. Kojève interprets Hegel through Marx and Heidegger, presenting the master-slave dialectic as the key to understanding all of history. He emphasizes the struggle for recognition as the fundamental human drive. And he makes a provocative claim: history has ended. Not in Hegel's time, but now, in the 20th century. Liberal democracy and consumer capitalism represent the final form of human society. There will be no more fundamental changes, just management and refinement. Among Kojève's students are some of the most influential French intellectuals. Jacques Lacan, who will use the master-slave dialectic in psychoanalysis. Georges Bataille, who will develop a theory of transgression and excess. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who will blend phenomenology and Marxism. Hegel becomes central to French philosophy in a way he never was in Germany after the 19th century. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. The Cold War ends. Liberal democracy seems triumphant. And Francis Fukuyama, a student of Kojève's ideas, writes, "The end of history and the last man." He argues that we've reached the end point Hegel predicted. All viable alternatives to liberal democracy have been exhausted. Not that wars or problems will end, but that the fundamental form of human political organization has been settled. This triggers enormous debate. Many see Fukuyama as absurdly optimistic. The 21st century brings terrorism, rising authoritarianism, climate crisis, technological disruption. History hasn't ended. If anything, it's accelerating. But the debate itself shows Hegel's enduring relevance. We're still arguing about whether history has direction, whether progress is real, whether freedom is actualizing itself or dissolving into new forms of domination. Contemporary political theory is full of Hegelian concepts. Recognition theory, the idea that social struggles are fundamentally about being recognized as having worth and dignity, descends directly from Hegel. Charles Taylor, Axel Honneth, and others have developed sophisticated theories of recognition that explain everything from identity politics to international conflict. And here's something surprising. Hegel is having a renaissance in Anglo-American philosophy. For most of the 20th century, analytic philosophers dismissed Hegel as obscure, mystical, unscientific. But in recent decades, philosophers like Robert Pippin, Terry Pinkard, and especially Robert Brandom have argued that Hegel can be read without the metaphysical baggage, that his insights about normativity, social practices, and self-consciousness are actually compatible with careful analytic philosophy. The debate continues. Hegel remains relevant, not because everyone agrees with him, but because he asks the right questions. How do we understand ourselves as both natural beings, subject to causation, and rational beings capable of freedom? How do we make sense of history's apparent chaos? How do we balance individual autonomy with social belonging? How do we comprehend the development of human consciousness through time? These questions don't go away, and Hegel's answers, even when we reject them, shape how we think about alternatives. Let's pause in the philosophy for a moment and talk about Hegel's writing. Because part of Hegel's legend is his obscurity, he's notoriously difficult to read. Dense, convoluted sentences that seem to go on forever. Abstract terminology that shifts meaning. Arguments that seem to spiral rather than proceed linearly. Here's a famous example, the opening sentence of The Science of Logic. Being, pure being, without any further determination. That's it. That's where the massive logical system begins, with pure, empty being. And then Hegel says this pure being is indistinguishable from nothing. Being and nothing are the same. Their truth is becoming, the movement from one to the other. What does that even mean? Hegel's trying to show that you can't start with static categories. The moment you try to think being in complete abstraction, without any properties or determinations, you find yourself thinking nothing. They collapse into each other. But that collapse is itself a movement, a process. And that process, becoming, is the truth of both being and nothing. This is vintage Hegel. Abstract, dialectical, paradoxical. And this is just the beginning of a book that goes on for hundreds of pages, moving through categories of quality, quantity, measure, essence, actuality, concept, life, idea. Why write this way? Partly it's German philosophical style. Kant wasn't exactly clear either. But Hegel has additional reasons. He's trying to show that thought itself has a dynamic, self-developing structure. He can't present this in straightforward propositions because propositions assume fixed terms standing in fixed relations. Hegel wants to show concepts moving, transforming, generating their opposites. And there's something else. Hegel believes that understanding requires work. You can't just passively receive truth. You have to think it through yourself, follow the dialectical movement in your own consciousness. The difficulty is intentional. It forces active engagement. But critics have always complained. Schopenhauer called Hegel a charlatan, his philosophy empty verbiage. Bertrand Russell said Hegel's logic was one of the strangest things in philosophy, an intellectual acrobatic. Popper accused Hegel of deliberately obscure writing to avoid criticism. There's probably truth to both sides. Hegel was genuinely trying to express something difficult, but he also could have been clearer. Some of the obscurity is necessary. Some is just bad writing. Still, there are moments of startling beauty in Hegel. The preface to the Phenomenology, written last even though it comes first, contains passages that still resonate. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. Philosophy comprehends its age only after the fact, after the living development is complete. The true is the whole. You can't understand anything in isolation, only in its full context. What is familiar is not thereby known. The things closest to us are often the hardest to truly understand, because familiarity breeds blindness. These aren't just clever phrases, they express deep insights about knowledge, history, and human understanding, and they show that Hegel, at his best, could write with genuine philosophical power. The systematic ambition itself has a kind of grandeur. Hegel's Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences tries to comprehend everything, logic, nature, mind, in one coherent system. Start with the categories of pure thought. Show how thought externalizes itself in nature. Show how nature produces mind, which then understands itself and the whole process. It's staggering in its scope, and that's been both Hegel's strength and his weakness. The systematic completeness is attractive. Everything connects to everything else. No questions are left dangling. But it's also rigid. If one part fails, the whole edifice is threatened. And modern philosophy has largely abandoned system building in favour of more piecemeal approaches. Yet there's something lost in that abandonment. Hegel's attempt to see connections, to show how different domains of inquiry relate to each other, to refuse the fragmentation of knowledge. This has value, even if the particular system doesn't succeed. And here's something worth considering as you drift towards sleep. Hegel's philosophy is fundamentally about reconciliation, not cheap reconciliation that glosses over real differences, but deep reconciliation that holds contradictions together, that sees opposition as productive rather than destructive, that believes understanding requires comprehending how apparent opposites are really moments of a larger whole. In a fragmented world, in an age of polarization, in a culture that emphasizes either or rather than both, and maybe Hegel's dialectical vision has something to offer. Not as a dogma, not as a complete system, but as an approach, as a willingness to hold contradictions, to see development through conflict, to trust that reconciliation is possible without eliminating difference. Let's return now to October 1806. We started there. Let's end there. The manuscript makes it to Bamberg. The pages Hegel sent that night, clutching desperately to his life's work, survive the chaos of war. The publisher, Heinrich Joseph von Soden, receives them. He's been pressuring Hegel to finish. The delays have been frustrating, but now he has the complete manuscript, the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's published in 1807. Initial reaction is mixed. Some recognize its brilliance, others are baffled. It's unlike anything that's come before. It doesn't fit existing categories. Is it philosophy, history, psychology, theology? It's all of these and none of these. Meanwhile, Hegel's life after Jena is difficult. The university collapses. Students flee. There's no money. Hegel is 37 years old with an illegitimate son to support and no prospects. He moves to Bamberg, becomes a newspaper editor. It's humiliating for a philosopher of his ambition, but he needs money. He edits articles, writes editorials praising Napoleon's administration, deals with petty local politics. His illegitimate son Ludwig haunts him. Christiane Fischer, Ludwig's mother, keeps the boy in Jena. Hegel sends what money he can, but it's never enough. Years later, when Hegel is finally established, he'll bring Ludwig to live with his legitimate family. It won't go well. Ludwig will never quite fit in, will struggle with his identity, will eventually die young serving in the Dutch colonial service in Indonesia. But in 1807, Hegel is just trying to survive. The Battle of Jena destroyed Old Prussia. Napoleon dominates Europe, and Hegel watches this all from the sidelines, no longer in the centre of events but working in provincial obscurity. He moves again to Nuremberg, becomes a school rector. He teaches philosophy to teenagers. He marries Marie von Tucher, 22 years old to his 41. They have 3 children. He writes the science of logic during these years, developing the pure logical system that underlies the phenomenology. Finally, in 1816, he gets a university position again at Heidelberg. Then, in 1818, the call to Berlin, the most prestigious philosophy chair in Germany. He's made it. The long struggle is over. The next 13 years in Berlin will be the height of his influence. Large lecture audiences, publications, recognition as the leading philosopher of the age. He dies suddenly in 1831. Cholera sweeps through Berlin. Hegel catches it and dies within days. He's 61. He's buried beside Fichte in Dorotheenstadt Cemetery. And immediately, the arguments begin. What did he really mean? What follows from his system? Was he a conservative or a revolutionary? His students split. His ideas spread. His influence grows even as people violently disagree about how to interpret him. That night in October 1806, watching Napoleon ride through Jena, Hegel had called him the world soul on horseback. The phrase is strange, mystical, provocative. But maybe what Hegel saw was this. History isn't just random events. History has meaning. And sometimes that meaning is concentrated in a single person, in a single moment, in a single action that will reverberate through centuries. Napoleon didn't know he was the world soul. He thought he was pursuing power and glory. But through him, despite him, the ideals of the French Revolution spread across Europe. Legal equality, rational administration, the end of feudalism. Not because Napoleon was benevolent, he wasn't, but because the historical moment was right, because consciousness was ready for transformation, because spirit was actualizing itself, using Napoleon as its instrument. Was Hegel right about this? History has been less kind to Napoleon than Hegel was. We see the bodies, the ruined cities, the suffering. We're less impressed by military genius when we know the human cost. and we're suspicious of any philosophy that seems to justify conquest in the name of progress. But maybe Hegel's point wasn't to justify Napoleon. Maybe his point was to see, in that specific historical moment, something larger at work. To see that ideas matter, that consciousness develops, that human beings are capable of understanding their own history and their own nature. To see that freedom, however imperfectly, is actualizing itself through time. And maybe, on that night in October 1806, with cannons in the distance and manuscript pages freshly sealed, Hegel felt something that transcended his personal fear and personal ambition. He felt connected to history itself. He felt he was witnessing and participating in a transformation. Philosophy and history meeting at one point. Thought and reality coinciding. The owl of Minerva preparing to spread its wings. The manuscript survived, the ideas survived. They changed, evolved, spawned responses and reactions and transformations. Hegel's system didn't become final and complete as he hoped, but his questions remain, his approach remains, his insistence that we can understand our own history, our own consciousness, our own nature. This remains. And as you settle into sleep tonight, consider this. Consciousness is always developing. Understanding is always deepening. We never arrive at a final endpoint where everything is transparent and complete. But we can comprehend more than we did yesterday. We can see patterns we couldn't see before. We can recognize that what seemed like chaos has structure. What seemed like randomness has meaning. Not because some cosmic spirit is pulling strings. Not because history follows an inevitable predetermined path. But because we're conscious beings trying to understand ourselves, and every attempt at understanding changes what we're capable of understanding next. This is the dialectic at work, not in some abstract realm, but in your own thinking. Every idea generates questions that push beyond it. Every answer reveals new problems. Every understanding makes visible what we didn't understand before. The journey of consciousness that Hegel described in the Phenomenology is your journey too. You're moving from immediate certainty through doubt and negation toward comprehension. Sometimes that movement is painful. Sometimes it requires giving up cherished beliefs. Sometimes it feels like losing yourself in order to find yourself more deeply. But this is how growth happens. This is how understanding emerges. Not smoothly, not comfortably, but through confrontation with what contradicts you, what challenges you, what forces you beyond where you are. Hegel saw this pattern everywhere, in individual development, in cultural evolution, in historical transformation. And whether or not his grand system is correct, whether or not spirit is actually actualizing itself through history, the pattern itself has power. The recognition that growth requires negation, that understanding requires struggle, that reconciliation requires holding contradiction rather than fleeing from it. These are truths that don't depend on metaphysical commitments. They're experiential truths, available to anyone who's ever tried to understand something difficult, who's ever changed their mind fundamentally, who's ever looked back at who they were and barely recognized themselves. The world soul on horseback rides through your consciousness too, not literally, not mystically, but as the force of transformation, the moments when everything you thought was solid liquefies and reforms in new patterns. These moments are terrifying and exhilarating. They're death and rebirth. They're the dialectic made personal. Hegel's life was marked by such moments, watching revolution from afar, seeing Napoleon up close, struggling with poverty and obscurity, finally achieving recognition. Each crisis forced development, each negation produced something new, and perhaps this is the wisdom to take from Hegel. Stripped of systematic pretension, change is necessary, contradiction is productive, negation serves life. What you are now is not what you'll be. What seems opposed will reveal unexpected connection. What dies enables what's born. The old world doesn't pass away quietly. The new world doesn't arrive pure and perfect, but consciousness keeps moving, keeps developing, keeps achieving fuller understanding. And you're part of that movement, whether you know it or not. Rest now in that knowledge. Let consciousness relax its grip. Let the dialectical movement quiet to stillness. Tomorrow will bring new contradictions, new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But tonight, be at peace with where you are, knowing that this moment too is part of a larger pattern. This rest too is necessary for what comes next. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. Wisdom comes at the end of the day when development is complete. So let this day complete itself. Let understanding settle into sleep. Let the world soul rest, having ridden far enough for now. History continues whether we watch or not. Consciousness develops whether we comprehend it or not. But sometimes, in moments of quiet, in the descent towards sleep, we catch glimpses of the pattern. We feel ourselves part of something larger. We sense that our small lives connect to vast movements we can barely imagine. Hegel devoted his life to making those connections visible, to showing how the smallest moment of consciousness and the grandest sweep of history are expressions of the same process. He didn't succeed completely. No one could. But he tried. And in trying, he opened possibilities for understanding that we're still exploring. So drift now into sleep with this thought. You are conscious. You are developing. You are part of history. And the same spirit, whether you call it that or not, that worked through empires and revolutions, works through your small struggles, your personal growth, your daily efforts to understand yourself and your world. This is consoling, not because it means you're important in some cosmic sense, but because it means you're connected. Your experience matters. Your understanding contributes. Your development participates in something larger than yourself. And in the morning, when consciousness returns, you'll continue the journey. You'll encounter contradictions that push you forward. You'll negate what you were yesterday in becoming who you are tomorrow. You'll participate, whether consciously or not, in the ongoing dialectic of existence. But for now, rest. The world soul can manage without your vigilance. History will unfold as it must, and consciousness will continue its long journey toward understanding, with or without your active participation in this moment. Sleep well, dear friends, and know that in sleeping you're not escaping the dialectic, but enacting another of its necessary moments. Rest serves work. Stillness serves movement. The unconscious serves consciousness. Even in sleep, spirit continues its patient, persistent journey toward knowing itself. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Hegel's magnificent, frustrating, profound vision. Subscribe to continue these journeys into the deepest corners of human thought. Like to support the channel. And above all, rest well, knowing that philosophy continues, consciousness develops, and the quest for understanding never ends. The world's soul rests now, its long ride complete for this day, and so can you. Let's take a moment now to step back from intellectual history and philosophical debates. Let's consider what Hegel's vision might offer to someone lying in bed tonight, contemplating their own life, their own struggles, their own search for meaning. Because at its heart, beneath all the obscure terminology and systematic ambition, Hegel's philosophy is about transformation, about how consciousness grows, about how suffering can be productive, about how contradiction drives us forward rather than destroying us. Think about the major transitions in your own life, times when you fundamentally changed, when you became someone different from who you were. Maybe it was leaving home, ending a relationship, changing careers, becoming a parent, facing loss. These transitions probably weren't smooth. They probably involved confusion, pain, a sense of losing yourself before finding a new self. Hegel would say, this is exactly how development happens. You can't grow by simply adding new qualities to an unchanged core. Growth requires negation, requires giving up what you were in order to become what you're becoming. The caterpillar doesn't smoothly transition to butterfly. It must dissolve into something formless in the chrysalis before reforming. This is the dialectic operating in personal life. Your old self, the thesis, encounters contradictions, experiences that don't fit, situations that demand more than you currently are. This creates crisis, the antithesis, the negation of what you were. And eventually, if you don't just retreat or break, you achieve a synthesis, a new self that preserves something of the old while fundamentally transforming it. The master-slave dialectic works at this personal level too. We all struggle for recognition. We all need others to acknowledge our value. And we've all experienced both sides of that dynamic. Times when we feel dependent on someone's approval. Times when we're the one whose recognition is sought. Times when relationships feel unbalanced and unsatisfying because genuine mutual recognition hasn't been achieved. Hegel's insight is that recognition can't be forced. You can't demand that someone acknowledge your worth. You can only earn it by demonstrating your worth through action, through work, through how you engage with the world. The slave achieves self-consciousness not through the master's recognition, but through creating, through transforming reality, through seeing themselves reflected in what they've made. This has profound implications for how we think about work, creativity, relationships. Your value doesn't depend on external validation. It emerges through what you do, how you act, what you create. Recognition follows from this, doesn't precede it. And Hegel's emphasis on history having meaning, having direction, this can be consoling even if we don't accept the full systematic version. Because the alternative is to see history as just one random thing after another. Suffering without purpose, progress an illusion. Hegel says, no, there are patterns, there's development. Consciousness is expanding even through the chaos. You don't have to believe in spirit or absolute knowing to find value in this. You can see it empirically. Human consciousness has developed. We understand more about the world than ancient peoples did. We've achieved forms of social organization that, however imperfect, provide more freedom than what came before. The long arc may bend toward justice, toward understanding, toward greater recognition of universal human dignity. This doesn't erase suffering, it doesn't justify violence, but it suggests that struggle serves something, that contradiction drives toward resolution, that the pain of development isn't meaningless. There's also something deeply calming in Hegel's insistence on comprehending rather than judging. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk. Understanding comes after the fact when development is complete. This means we can't fully understand where we are while we're still in the middle of it. We can't judge our age by the standards of some imagined perfect future. We can only understand the logic of how we got here and where present contradictions might lead. This cultivates a kind of patient attention rather than rushed judgment. Things are as they are for reasons. Those reasons can be understood, and understanding them is the first step toward moving beyond them. Consider your own struggles tonight. Whatever you're facing, professional challenges, relationship difficulties, personal anxieties, moral confusion, these aren't just obstacles to be overcome. They're moments in your development. They're contradictions pushing you toward new synthesis. They're necessary, even if painful, steps in consciousness, achieving fuller self-understanding. This doesn't mean being passive. Hegel isn't counseling acceptance of everything as it is. The dialectic is driven by struggle, by active engagement with contradictions. But it does mean recognizing that your struggles are part of a process, that confusion can be productive, that not knowing is sometimes necessary before new knowing can emerge. And there's wisdom in Hegel's integration of opposites. Modern thought tends toward either or, either individual or society, either freedom or constraint, either reason or passion, either science or faith. Hegel says both and. Individuals only become free individuals through social institutions. Freedom requires structure, reason and passion work together. Faith and philosophy address the same truths from different perspectives. This reconciling tendency, this willingness to hold contradictions together rather than choosing sides, feels especially valuable in our polarized age. We're constantly pushed to take absolute positions, to see everything as black and white, to believe that agreement with one side requires complete rejection of the other. Hegel's dialectical approach suggests a different possibility. Opposing positions usually contain partial truths. The way forward isn't to choose one side, but to comprehend how both sides are moments of a larger truth that includes and transcends both. This doesn't mean wishy-washy compromise. It means thinking harder, seeing more deeply, recognizing complexity. Consider political disagreements. progressives emphasize change, justice, liberation from old constraints. Conservatives emphasize stability, tradition, the wisdom embedded in existing institutions. From a Hegelian perspective, both capture something true. Change is necessary, consciousness develops, new contradictions emerge that old forms can't address. But change must be intelligent, must preserve what's valuable from tradition while transforming what's no longer viable. The synthesis isn't a mushy middle ground. It's a new position that comprehends why both sides were partially right, what each was responding to, and how their insights can be integrated into something richer than either alone. This applies to personal dilemmas too. Should you prioritize career or family? Should you be independent or interdependent? Should you trust reason or follow intuition? These aren't really either-or choices. The challenge is achieving a life that integrates both sides, that finds ways to be ambitious and connected, independent and interdependent, rational and intuitive in appropriate contexts. Hegel's systematic thinking, his drive to show how everything connects, can also offer solace. We often feel fragmented, like different aspects of our lives don't hang together. Work persona is different from family persona is different from inner life. We compartmentalize, keep different parts separate. Hegel's vision is that integration is possible, that a coherent self can hold diverse roles and capacities together, not by eliminating differences, but by understanding how they relate, how each serves the others, how they're all expressions of one developing consciousness. This is aspirational, not descriptive. Nobody achieves perfect integration, but the possibility of it, the work toward it, gives direction and meaning to personal development. There's also something powerful in Hegel's emphasis on work, on labour, on the slave achieving freedom through transformation of the material world. We live in a culture that often devalues work, seeing it as necessary evil rather than source of meaning. But Hegel suggests that work, the active engagement with reality, the transformation of raw materials into useful objects, the solving of practical problems, this is where consciousness actualizes itself. When you create something, when you figure out how to do something difficult, when you contribute meaningfully to shared projects, you're not just producing external results, you're developing yourself. You're achieving the recognition that comes from demonstrable competence. You're seeing yourself reflected in the world you've helped shape. This applies to all kinds of work, physical, intellectual, creative, care work. What matters isn't the type, but the quality of engagement. Are you actively transforming reality? Are you developing skills and capacities? Are you contributing to something beyond immediate self-interest? The master in Hegel's parable becomes passive, dependent, infantilized, because they don't work. They consume without producing. The slave develops authentic freedom through work. This reversal contains profound insight about the relationship between activity and freedom. Freedom isn't the absence of constraint or effort. Freedom is the capacity to act effectively, to achieve purposes, to shape reality according to rational plans. And that capacity only develops through practice, through struggle with resistance, through the discipline of work. As you prepare for sleep tonight, you might reflect on what you've worked on today. Not just paid employment, but any active engagement with the world. Conversations where you tried to understand or be understood. Problems you wrestled with. Things you made or fixed or improved. Each of these is a moment of consciousness actualizing itself, of spirit, if you want to use Hegel's terminology, coming to know itself through your activity. And tomorrow will bring new opportunities for such actualization. New problems to solve, new contradictions to engage, new occasions for development. The dialectic continues. Consciousness keeps moving. Understanding deepens. And you participate in this larger movement through every thoughtful engagement with reality. This is Hegel's gift, beneath all the obscurity and system building. The recognition that development is possible, that consciousness can grow, that contradictions drive forward rather than destroying, that work has meaning, that recognition matters, that history has direction, even if we can't fully see where it's going. You don't have to accept Hegel's complete system to find value in these insights. You don't have to believe in absolute spirit or the end of history or the world soul on horseback. You can take what's useful, the dialectical method, the emphasis on recognition, the reconciliation of opposites, the faith that development is possible through struggle. And as consciousness relaxes its grip, as sleep approaches, you can rest knowing that the journey continues, that your struggles serve your growth, that contradiction is productive, that the darkness before dawn is part of the cycle that brings new light. The dialectic operates even in sleep. Consciousness negates itself, enters the formlessness of dreams, prepares for the synthesis of waking. Rest serves activity. Unconsciousness serves consciousness. The letting go enables the taking up. So release now into that necessary negation. Let the day's development settle. Let synthesis occur in darkness. Trust the process that Hegel described in philosophy and that you enact in living. The owl of Minerva waits for dusk, but morning always follows night. New understanding emerges from the darkness of not knowing, and consciousness, patient and persistent, continues its long journey toward fuller awareness. Hegel died suddenly, but his ideas continue living, developing, transforming through generations of thinkers who engage them. The conversation continues, the dialectic moves forward, and you're part of it, whether consciously or not, through every act of thinking, creating, recognizing, developing. Rest well in this knowledge. The world soul doesn't require your constant vigilance. History unfolds according to its own logic, and consciousness will resume its work tomorrow, refreshed by this necessary pause, ready for new contradictions, new struggles, new syntheses. The phenomenology traced consciousness from its most primitive forms to absolute knowing. But knowing is never final. Each answer generates new questions. Each synthesis becomes the thesis for a new dialectical movement. Development never stops. And that's not exhausting. It's liberating. Because it means growth is always possible, understanding can always deepen, and no failure is final. So sleep now, dear friends. The philosophy of transformation continues in dreams, in the mysterious processes of consolidation and renewal that occur in darkness. And when you wake, you'll participate again in the grand adventure Hegel tried to articulate, the journey of consciousness coming to know itself through the encounter with reality, with others, with the contradictions that drive us forward into fuller forms of life. Thank you for spending this time exploring one of philosophy's most ambitious, controversial and enduring visions. Thank you for engaging with ideas that have shaped how we understand history, consciousness, freedom, and human development. Subscribe to continue these nocturnal explorations of philosophy's deepest questions. Like to support this work. And above all, rest peacefully, knowing that the dialectic never ends, consciousness never stops developing, and the search for understanding continues through every generation, every individual, every thoughtful engagement with the mystery of existence. The world soul rests now, and so can you. Before we close, let me return one final time to that moment in October 1806, to Hegel watching Napoleon ride through Jena, to the manuscript sent through a war zone, to philosophy and history meeting at a single point. That moment encapsulates everything Hegel's philosophy tried to capture, the individual making history without understanding the full significance of their actions, the philosopher comprehending what the actor cannot see, the ideas of the revolution becoming concrete reality through military conquest, consciousness achieving self-understanding by looking back at what it has done. Napoleon probably never thought about himself as the world soul. He thought about tactics, supply lines, political alliances, personal glory. But Hegel saw something Napoleon couldn't see, how Napoleon's individual ambitions served larger historical purposes, how the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality were spreading across Europe through conquest, how one man concentrated in himself the spirit of an age. Was Hegel right? Was Napoleon really the world soul on horseback? Or was this philosopher's vanity, the delusion that history serves some grand purpose when really it's just accident and power? We can't answer definitively, but we can recognize something true in Hegel's vision even if we reject his metaphysics. History does have patterns, consciousness does develop. Human beings do achieve greater self-understanding over time. The way we live now reflects millennia of cultural, political, and intellectual development. We stand on foundations built by countless previous generations, and there's something moving about the image itself. The philosopher at his window watching the emperor ride past, seeing in that moment the convergence of thought and action, the actualization of ideas in historical events, the long development of consciousness achieving a visible form. That's what philosophy can do at its best. Not predict the future, not control events, but comprehend their meaning, see the patterns, articulate what's implicit in our historical moment. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk, but when it does, the darkness becomes illuminated, the day's confusion becomes comprehensible, and consciousness achieves another step in its long journey towards self-understanding. Hegel devoted his life to that work of comprehension. He succeeded in ways even he couldn't fully anticipate, and failed in ways he couldn't acknowledge. But the attempt itself, the systematic effort to understand consciousness, history, and their development, remains inspiring even when we reject specific conclusions. And perhaps that's the final lesson to take from Hegel. Not his system, not his specific claims, but his conviction that understanding is possible, that reality has intelligible structure, that patient thought can penetrate appearance to grasp essence, that consciousness can come to know itself. In an age of fragmentation, of information overload, of competing narratives that seem irreconcilable, Hegel's systematic ambition feels both impossible and necessary. We can't build complete systems anymore. We know too much about the contingency of thought, the perspectival nature of knowing, the limits of any single framework. But we still need synthesis, still need to see connections, still need to believe that understanding is possible. Maybe the dialectic applies to philosophy itself. Hegel represents the thesis, systematic comprehension, total integration, absolute knowing. Postmodernism represents the antithesis, fragmentation, perspectivism, the impossibility of totality. And we're groping towards some synthesis that preserves both insights, systematic thinking that acknowledges its limits, integration that respects difference, understanding that remains open to what exceeds its grasp. That synthesis, if it comes, will be something Hegel would recognize as dialectical development, even as it moves beyond anything he imagined. Because that's how consciousness works. Each age comprehends what previous ages couldn't. Each thinker stands on the shoulders of their predecessors. And the conversation continues. The dialectic moves forward, understanding deepens. You're part of this conversation even in the simplicity of your evening contemplation. When you think about your life, when you try to understand your choices, when you wrestle with contradictions between what you want and what's possible, when you seek recognition or offer it to others, in all of this, you're enacting the patterns Hegel tried to describe. The master-slave dialectic plays out in your relationships. The development of consciousness happens in your learning and growth. The reconciliation of opposites occurs in your efforts to integrate conflicting aspects of yourself. And the long journey toward freedom continues in every choice you make to engage thoughtfully with reality, rather than fleeing into illusion or passivity. Philosophy, at its deepest, isn't about memorizing arguments or mastering systems. It's about learning to think more clearly, to see more deeply, to live more consciously. Hegel offers tools for this work, the dialectical method, the emphasis on contradiction, the faith in comprehension, the recognition of development. Use what serves you, leave what doesn't. But recognize that engaging seriously with Hegel, even in disagreement, exercises capacities essential to philosophical life, the ability to follow complex arguments, to hold contradictions without premature resolution, to see multiple perspectives on fundamental questions, to think historically about how ideas develop. And now, as we finally reach the end of this long journey through Hegel's thought, let silence return. Let the concepts that have filled the last hours settle into rest. Let consciousness relax its effortful grasp and descend into the gentler rhythms of dream and sleep. The dialectic continues whether you watch or not. History unfolds whether you comprehend or not. Consciousness develops whether you participate actively or rest. Tomorrow will bring new contradictions, new struggles, new opportunities for synthesis. But tonight, simply be, simply rest, simply allow the mystery of existence to hold you without demanding understanding. Hegel spent his life trying to comprehend that mystery. He achieved remarkable insights. He also revealed the limits of human understanding, the point where systematic thought must acknowledge something that exceeds its grasp. Perhaps that acknowledgement is wisdom too, knowing what can be known while respecting what remains mysterious. So sleep now in that mystery. The world soul, if such a thing exists, doesn't require your vigilance. History's long arc bends according to its own logic, and consciousness will resume its work tomorrow, patient and persistent as always, continuing the endless journey toward fuller awareness that defines rational being. Sweet dreams, dear friends. May the dialectic work gently in your sleep, transforming today's contradictions into tomorrow's syntheses, preparing you for the ongoing adventure of conscious existence. Thank you for this time together, exploring ideas that have shaped our world. May you wake refreshed, aware, ready to participate once more in the grand process of consciousness coming to know itself through living thoughtfully in the world. Rest well, the phenomenology continues, the journey never ends, and consciousness, eternal and patient, awaits your return. Good night.